Hey there.
Hey, Alex, you back from vacation?
Yeah, I am. I just got back yesterday, so nice to get back into it.
I'm sure. Well, welcome back. Hopefully it was relaxing.
Yeah, it was good. There was some wildfires in Bordeaux, but I was further into the east in Bergerac near the Dordogne, which was very nice.
Nice. Hey, Justin, good morning.
Hello, good morning. How's everyone doing today?
Yeah, no complaints. Still early though.
Plenty of time.
Where are you based, Mike?
Detroit,
Okay,
just north of Detroit.
very convenient for KubeCon for you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the recommendation for everybody traveling to KubeCon, book your accommodation now.
Yeah. I have an extra bed in the attic. It's really drafty though, so
I booked mine. For mine was like one of the first things I actually did, immediately booking it. No, because I was with the lab in Detroit.
Yep. Maybe I can rent out part of my house as like an Airbnb.
It could be a new feature of your house.
Yep. There you go. Cool. All right. Excuse me. It looks like Justin, you volunteered to be the scribe. Are you still good with that?
So good with it. I'm trying to
Cool.
find the docs,
Thank
which
you.
I think I found.
yeah, and I'll try and because it looks like you have some topics too. I'll try and keep on top of things when you're speaking, Justin.
Thanks.
All right. Guess we can probably just go ahead and get started. Cool. Let's see. Looking through, looks like there may be a few new attendees. If you're new and feel comfortable introducing yourself, if you don't mind, maybe raising your hand or something, or just unmuting yourself and saying hi. Oh, yeah. Thanks, Eloise. And the meeting notes are in the chat if you're interested in following along or adding any topics. All right. Cool. So I just want to kick off with a few just achievements that happened over the last few weeks. We'll try to probably highlight these in future meetings as well, but went ahead and just released the spec version 0.1.0. So that's been tagged with release notes and things like that. And I also opened up an issue just kind of proposing the spec beta, I suppose, which I suppose could be the 0.2 release. So if you're working on an SDK, try to make sure that you're compliant with the tagged spec release. And then if you have any interest or feedback on the beta spec, take a look at that proposal. And then if there's anything missing, certainly let us know if there's something that you feel strongly about, or if the priority of any item you disagree with, certainly make your case on the thread, and we can talk about that. Once we have some feedback on there, I'll go ahead and just lock that in and try to update the roadmap and make sure that the issues that exist are all well defined, so we can start figuring out the timeline on the spec release.
Mike, since you couldn't find the last couple of meetings, do we have a clear definition of what beta means?
I mean, that's part of, I suppose, this proposal out there is what needs to be included in this release. So, I mean, for me, I would say that the beta release should include everything that we would want in GA, essentially, because I would think that we'd want to make sure that the beta is kind of encompassing enough to to not require like major breaking changes for any kind of GA release. So that should include at least the thought of how we would handle client-side feature flagging, and some of like the eventing and things like that. So that was my main thought behind some of the proposals there. One of the items on there that's come up a couple times is like tracking events, and that's a thing that at the moment I have written as kind of a low priority, and that might be something that the community kind of disagrees with. They're certainly popular in a lot of feature flagging libraries. So I'm just trying to decide if that makes sense. That's something that we'd want to tackle as part of a beta release or not. So So yeah, I mean, that's kind of the purpose of that issue, is to kind of discuss like what we would like to consider beta. And so for me, it's basically just achieving sufficient coverage of existing, kind of what you'd expect out of a feature flagging tool. And for me, a lot of that is just, the eventing and like some of the life cycle of like the starting up and the cleanly shutting down of providers and stuff is stuff that I think needs to be covered still. But yeah, the scope can be, I suppose, up for debate. So
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
I think scope and maturity are two different things. And just if we don't have defined them, like should I as a feature flagging provider implement beta? What can I expect there? I think down the road we will have features that might be alpha, and we might be able to steal something there from other projects, but it's open telemetry or Kubernetes, how they're naming APIs and specs.
Okay.
Just
Yeah, I
what's
mean,
the expectation, like I mean, we have most of the people like constantly working on it, but I think it would be just good housekeeping to have a definition of what we call beta.
okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, the sort of hard part about looking too closely at what OpenTelemetry does is they have everything slapped as experimental still. So for the most part, so I think eventually we need to like try to stabilize it sooner than later. So, providers and stuff can have a little bit more confidence that we're not going to rip the, carpet out from under them or something. So, but yeah, no, I think that makes sense.
The OTel use case is interesting because they strongly align to the stages of incubation within the CNCF as their North Star for alpha, beta, graduated status. So I think that they're very tentative about graduating further in that process, because that also binds a level of supportability to the tools. And I think until we've had that conversation about how we want to support the open community, that we should be very, very cautious about it. Like Alois says, when something goes to beta, there's a level of expectation around how we're handling user issues, and for our providers also.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so yeah, the takeaway there is just working on a definition of what beta even means, so I can try to take that as an action item, and then I'll post that in the Slack channel when I have something, and we can kind of debate about it there. Cool. Next big one, and Ben, thanks for joining. But the kind of exciting .NET release, so the 0.1.1 is now on NuGet, and we've also reserved the OpenFeature prefix. So like now it's like got the little like official check mark next to it, which is pretty cool. So yeah, appreciate the help there, Ben. Nicely done. Cool, and that's it for major updates here. A lot of things happening behind the scenes there. One more, I suppose, announcement. It's not really an achievement per se, but I did start signing up for some of our different accounts that we're eligible for. So there's like a password manager that we have access to as well. So if there's any reason to add secrets there, feel free to ping me and we can go ahead and add that to this shared organization password manager. And if there's any other like services that you feel like we should sign up for, let me know. We can try to see what they have available. I did start the process of reserving an organization on Docker Hub, but I have not heard anything back. So that's something I'll continue to pursue to see if we can, get that reserved. But yeah, just kind of going through the process of just registering the organization and a bunch of different tools. So more information to come there. If there's anything that you specifically need, send it out in Slack or ping me or something, and we can go ahead and reserve that. Cool. It looks like Justin's up next.
Alex had a question.
Oh, sure.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so can we make sure that all passwords for like npm, brew, and those sort of things we're using LastPass, and then have multiple groups inside of LastPass to make sure that that's federated access? Does that make sense to you folks?
Conceptually, yeah. I just don't know how it, like for npm, for example, it just has like a membership list. So it's like, you would just invite them and do it just like a out of band kind of access control. So I'm not sure how that would apply.
It's just an example, but like,
Sure.
so push tokens for npm, that kind of thing, like CI push tokens, just so that we don't have like critical level access in there, but at least so the community and folks who are contributors, if we need to set up a new action in a CI/CD thing, we've got kind of a reference for that. I think that could be a really useful way to use LastPass.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. So what I had started on yesterday was creating, and you may see it floating around now, it's an OpenFeature bot account. So we could actually have like a personal access token associated with that account as opposed to my personal or something. And that is in the 1Pass or 1Password account right now. So if you need that, we can just provide access to that account and then start using that for certain situations. So it's brand new. I just set it up yesterday. So there may be a few changes, but that was kind of the idea there for some of these shared accounts and services. We could use that as opposed to, tying it to personal accounts. Cool. Sorry about that. Justin, you want to do yours, please? You're muted.
Unmuted, great. Provider hooks. So Shantanu, who's on my team at eBay, is put forward this question, which is, should providers be able to register hooks that are not actions that users need to take? So we're building a feature flagging thing internally. In our case, we happen to also be interested in having the same API work for our experimentation platform internally. And there are needs we have around kind of setup and tear down of this client itself, but also we're going to be doing tracking events. And the way that eBay does it, it would be very useful to us to not have the support burden of, okay, if you want to use our thing, you have to use our client, instantiate our client, and then also here are 4 hooks that you need to put in this order that are specific to our implementation so that everything works properly.
Yeah, for me, I think it makes perfect sense. And I actually prototyped it in the Node SDK in like 15 minutes. Like it's actually pretty trivial to register this. So I have no problem with it, but I'd be kind of curious to hear other people's opinions on that. And there is an issue open for anyone that's just catching up on this. I think we can post that to the chat.
My only feedback is that I think it makes the context transformer concept completely redundant. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It just handles the same, it handles that problem as a subset. So I'm in favor for it for that reason, because I really think the context transformer has been seen to be useful. It's been used in a few integrations already. Because it makes sense that you need to take the OpenFeature context, which is very flexible, and refine it into something that a particular provider needs. So I could easily see provider hooks being a place to accomplish that. Yeah, so I'm in favor of it from that perspective. And the context transformer was kind of always a little bit of an optional thing anyway. It would be easy to kind of remove that from the spec and replace it with this, which is more powerful. Yeah, I guess my only 2 thoughts kind of towards a more cautious direction are not polluting the word hooks too much to a point where it's confusing. Like we need to make sure that it's very clear that this is a different than the application author facing hooks. So I don't know if it makes sense to kind of rename things a little bit or maybe come up with a different name. I mean, I guess it is very similar to the application author facing hook. So maybe it would be a bad idea to go with something completely different. But something to think about. The other thing is again, looking at OpenTelemetry has a hard separation between the API they present to authors and the API they present to people developing kind of extensions. So, the thing that can be optionally included in all kinds of dependencies is very thin and only has application author facing stuff. And then they have SDK packages that have these, concepts and abstractions for creating things like different syncs or collectors or whatever. So that may be something we want to consider as we add abstractions and artifacts to our SDK. It gets bigger, and so the proposition of including it into a third-party library, for instance, becomes more tenuous. I mean, this is a minor thing, so it wouldn't be, I don't think it's a deal breaker, but just something to keep in mind. And we could always do that split later down the road if we wanted to. We could make, we can keep the SDK what it is and then split out an API that is just the application author-facing components later if we wanted to. That's my 2 cents.
I also have a question around one of the things talked about before was supporting multiple providers. If there's clashing hooks, or it kind of abstracts that away from the user managing it. So it's just higher possibility of issues there.
Yep.
I think that we've talked about supporting multiple providers. When we talked about that, one thing that I can't remember if it was Justin or maybe it was Pete. Somebody kind of had the idea of like a mega provider, which would amalgamate multiple providers. So you would write a provider that just has other providers in it, which seems like it would be a fairly elegant solution. And I think that in that case, you would want those provider specific hooks to run, right? Because you're basically aggregating other providers into your mega provider. I don't know if it's that simple.
Yeah.
But that would be one way to handle it, to actually not to directly support multiple providers, but to do it that way. Just an idea.
Yeah, I think it just comes down to how it's implemented. It's just something for us to keep in mind if providers are registering it. There is a higher possibility of clash is there. Not that it's an actual like blocking issue.
I wonder,
Yeah.
like, that thing that Justin was saying about wanting to, as a kind of provider, wanting to kind of have a bunch of stuff that's kind of essentially not wanting to avoid like requiring the application implementer to kind of like install this hook here and do this stuff. Like, it kind of reminds me a little bit of that OTel thing of like, I think they're called bundles or distributions or something, where it's like a pre-configured kind of set of things bundled, like wired together kind of for you. And I'm wondering whether like, if we solve this one case of like, we want to kind of like have hooks, but like managed by the provider, whether we then whether you then, as you're building this, will find out like, oh, actually, we also have this other thing that we kind of want the provider to be able to do. And then like, I wonder whether we're going to end up wanting to have a more general abstraction of like a way to let the provider kind of like wire stuff up ahead of time. And then we could avoid having to have this whole extra thing, and we could just use regular hooks and use that mechanism to kind of pre-wire things. I'm not sure I'm articulating my.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was kind of what I had done in my little local prototype. Was inside the provider itself, you would just like register hooks, so it'd be completely abstracted away from the developer, but it would tap into the same like life cycle that we already have, built in the SDKs. So then it's just kind of like, it would be the thing that would run closest to flag evaluation, basically. And so you could use that to like say inside the provider, say you could have it throw or something if the targeting key was missing or something like that. You could do that in a provider hook, which would just tap into the existing mechanisms.
I think if
That
I
makes
understood
sense.
Pete's proposition correctly, like that's one way we could do it, but I think what I was understanding from Pete is kind of a way to basically attach multiple hooks or even a provider, basically an entire configuration to bundle that in a single API. So you could say OpenFeature dot add Dynatrace or whatever, and it would add some kind of provider, it would add some kind of hooks. It's basically a bundle of pre-configured of OpenFeature pre-configured in a certain way.
Yeah, and I think like I what I imagine that being more commonly showing up for is not like a vendor specific thing, but like a big enterprisey company specific thing of like our recipe of like, we use this, we talk to Dynatrace and this other thing, and we got that weird logging framework that everyone hates that we need to set up, and all those things. Like, I think I don't want us to build. I don't think like I'm nervous about us kind of like saying, oh, that sounds like a fun thing to define a spec for, and then we end up like having an extra spec. But it just occurred to me that like solving that more generally might be better than having to do like a special case for this hook thing and then realizing we end up wanting to solve this problem anyway down the road.
Yeah,
the
no,
only-
that makes sense. Sorry, go ahead, Justin.
The only other places where we have extension points in my mind is around like startup and teardown life cycle. Like you don't have any hooks for that. But I'm not sure, like beyond that, I'm not clear on when we would have other extension points that we would use this bundled concept for, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think it could like in my understanding, I think it would most likely be a provider with a set of hooks. So like the suite would be, hey, it's this provider, and also like here are these related hooks that you would want to use. That's probably what these bundles would contain, at least at this point. But I agree with Pete in that I think we should just kind of have a quick thought experiment, maybe in a different meeting or maybe in a thread, about if that is a potentially better way to solve the provider hooks issue than provider hooks. But I'm not necessarily saying that. I just think it is kind of a good quick thought experiment to go through, because at least when you described it, Justin, your use case was like, oh, we have this kind of pattern, we want to set this up, we want to do this teardown or whatever, and it sounds like Pete's proposal could solve your problem by just adding your provider and then adding a certain set of hooks, if I'm understanding correctly, and that would just be part of the suite. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Yeah, I think considering it makes a ton of sense. And maybe the next step, Justin, we just introduced that exactly what Alex just posted, the OpenFeature enhancement proposal flow. It's pretty new, so maybe a little rough around the edges, but worth trying to go through that research. Go to the research repo and then basically open a pull request with the proposal in there, and we can kind of have a conversation in that thread. And then once we come to a consensus, we would just merge that over so we have the history of kind of what the decision was. The one thing just quickly worth noting about the provider hooks, the one benefit would be the order. Like you'd be guaranteed to say like this would run basically last, which could have a lot of benefits as well. But that could be something that we could just cover in the thread. But I think having like kind of the thought experiment documented in that thread would probably be pretty beneficial for future us, I suppose.
Just been thinking about multiple providers. I could imagine there'd be a fairly large class of problem and confusion around those, like a huge, like, do they run asynchronously? Do they not? Which one runs first? Which doesn't? Like, that sounds like a massive ball of wool, and a mega provider, which also as a word is amazing. It would solve a lot of those. Well, it would solve all of those problems, right? Like just go and bind the two together however you want. But otherwise, I just think you're going to sort of half solve the problem for everyone, and the other half's going to be a mess.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't really talked too much about a mega provider, and I think it would be kind of depend on the situation. And I think theoretically it would work, but there'd be a lot of questions out there, and it would really be up to whoever decides to implement it. Does it make sense? Does it actually solve the problems that they're intending to solve? I think it's sort of out of scope for what we're trying to do at the moment, though.
Yeah, for sure, I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I can see use cases, but I think we should also, like, for the OFABs, try to describe the use case that you want to handle. Like an obvious one might be you're triggering certain feature flags more on the, say, product manager line of business side, and they're using different tooling, and you have more on the infrastructure DevOps side, and they will use different tools. So usually they should not interfere with each other because they are triggering entirely different feature flags, at least in an ideal world. But yeah, I think I'm with Pete here. We might open a can of worms if we don't get this right and get like undeterministic behavior.
I mean, like, so that use case is exactly the thing that I was thinking of when I was talking about it. Is like, you know, someone's using like the devs are using Split for their stuff, and then someone's using like I don't know, an A/B testing thing, and like from the application author's perspective, they shouldn't care. They should just be asking for the state of a feature flag, and it should all be kind of hidden ideally. I think, like, personally, I think a success criteria kind of almost for us, like as kind of like defining the spec, is like, can you do that mega provider concept entirely in user land and not like just using the standard kind of provider mechanism rather than having some kind of special case stuff in OpenFeature itself.
I think that's a good point. I think I would guess that we have all the primitives required to do it, but it would be an interesting experiment if anybody wants to have some fun.
Yeah, perfect. I think that's good conversation. I think the next step, Justin, it would just be maybe moving that to an enhancement proposal stage then, and we can talk about it in there. That makes sense?
Oh, fit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. Looks like you have one more item that you want to discuss.
So I created this groups.io thing. So we had a common email address. CNCF gave us a group called OpenFeature maintainers.cncf.io or whatever. I think we should probably delete this groups.io thing and use the CNCF one. But
that works for me. I'll just have to go through and make a few changes. So let me do that first before you delete it. But that can be an action item for me. Cool. Todd, looks like you're up next.
Yeah, so this is something that a few people have mentioned. I think Alex brought it up a couple weeks or a couple meetings ago, but it's been mentioned before that too. So I have a PR. I have a PR that I did not link, but I will do that right now. And this is a PR for kind of a cross-platform, like a POC for a cross-platform test suite. And oh yeah, it is in there. Great. So I'll quickly demo that. It should be really quick, and just do a quick explanation. So the goal here was to be able to define a kind of platform agnostic end-to-end behavior somewhere, probably in some repo that we could use as a submodule for SDKs, and then the SDKs could all test against it. So I was going to kind of just build this from scratch, and then Dave Johnson had, since they built something similar at Harness, he actually kind of pointed me in the direction of maybe using Cucumber, which I thought was a really interesting proposal. So that's what I did. And I'll show you what that looks like. So this is basically a very incomplete, or just a POC kind of amount of code, and it just does some basic tests. It's all written in Gherkin, which is the Cucumber language for specifying tests. And so this is like a full end-to-end kind of test setup, and then has kind of included assertions and state. So the idea is that every SDK could have this feature, and then they would use the Gherkin parsing libraries and functionality available in that language to kind of evaluate these same set of features. And I did confirm that basically in every single language we're interested in supporting, there is Gherkin support. I'll show you what that looks like in JavaScript here. So basically these tests match the Gherkin you see on the left. So the idea is that if any of these expressions don't match, the test fails. If any of these test cases are missing, the test fails, and it pulls out values from the actual Gherkin and uses that as test data. So they get injected into the test. So this is basically how all these kind of frameworks work. So the one missing piece then is, because this is an integration test, we need kind of a consistent back end. I didn't want to kind of put the burden of mocking a provider on every single implementation. So I think I came up with a fairly elegant solution for that. It's basically show you a distribution of flag D that has a built-in configuration. So it's just this little, it adds basically one layer to a flag D image, and then we have it published at flag D testbed, I think is what I called it right now on our GitHub. So the basic TLDR is you can run this this flag D container, just run it in Docker, and it exposes flag D with configurations that kind of match this gherkin. So there's flags with the expected kind of color values in here, you know, for whatever flag it is, the expected values are in there. So this is running obviously on my machine now, and then I can run these integration tests. And basically it's going to set up a provider that talks to flag D, run the evaluations end to end, and you know, we get basically an end-to-end test suite, just to prove that that's actually working. I'll run the integration again without running the container, and you'll see everything just fails, because the values aren't available, so everything just defaults. So that's the idea. So really what we need to do to kind of implement this everywhere, we have to find a place to put this. We could even kind of embed these scenarios into non-normative sections in the spec if we felt like it, or we could have a separate repo for them. But then we'd just kind of pull that as a submodule and any SDK that wanted to implement this, and they would write the gherkin tests, and that's it. I would recommend we keep them fairly high level. It would all be black box kind of end-to-end testing. So, you know, no implementation details are really captured here, but it gives us kind of a layer of like a sanity check for some basic high-level behaviors. That's more or less all I had. Anybody have questions about that?
Yeah, I have one question, which is, it seems to suppose that there's a flag D client for your language. That's
Yes.
going to be baked into the SDK question mark.
So right now, I guess this is something that I'll talk about in a second. Maybe I should have had these points in different orders, but right now we have the node contribs repo up, which has the flag D provider in it. That's where I would suggest we have flag D provider implementations for every language. So I was going to hopefully start working on a Java contribs repo, something I would like to get some help with, but I don't think it should be in the SDK. No, I think it should be in the contribs repo, the same place we would put pre-built hooks, that kind of thing.
So the Java test suite has a dependency on the Java contribs library to run flag D providers, which would then have a dependency back on the Java SDK.
Yes, and that is an interesting problem. We had it's only a test dependency. So that is how this PR works. Basically, this PR includes a dependency back on the indirectly back on the Node SDK. That's not really an issue in this case, based on how the tests are written. I'm not sure if that would cause like a class path issue in Java, but it's a great point. So we may want to think about how that works. I'm kind of hesitant to bundle the flag D provider in with the SDK though. So that's my take there. But yeah, that could be a class path issue. It could be a weird dependency cycle issue in some languages. Again, it works fine in JavaScript, but I don't know if it would be a problem in other languages.
Something that always kind of hurts my brain a little bit with these kind of, I think it's a really interesting approach. I think it's a really good approach. One thing that always really hurts my brain a bit with these kind of like integration tests is like, what are we actually testing? Like, are we testing the provider? Are we testing the actual running provider? Are we testing the the SDK implementation, the OpenFeature SDK implementation, we're testing like the provider implementation, like, or is it all of the above, or could be multiple things?
So I think
Yeah, so it's an integration test. So there's definitely, it doesn't have, it's not a fully granular test. What I would argue what's being tested here is some of the basic SDK functionality. So the actual, the defaulting behavior, like what we could test is the defaulting behavior, the evaluation behavior, the context passing behavior. So for example, we don't do this here, but in the flag D test bed distribution, we would have some flags that include rules that, given a certain context data that comes in,
Yeah,
the particular evaluated value would be expected. So it makes sure that the context is getting passed all the way through to the provider.
Yeah.
It makes sure that if a flag is not, we can make sure that if a flag is not found by the provider, for instance, that the default is fired. So it would be mostly the SDK functionality itself that's being tested here.
Got it.
Because the flag D provider is used, and because flag D is configured in the background, those aren't really under test.
Yeah.
I hope that answers your question.
I think it does. I think it would be really good to write that down somewhere and just make it clear. I also think that, and I'm a little worried to say this, but like, I think you could also use this for other purposes, right? So you could have this also be a test suite for the provider implementations, right? Where you say there's this kind of set of kind of fixture kind of flag data, like for every provider, set up a set of flags with these values, and when we run this test suite, when we wire up your provider in our SDK and run this test suite, then it should return all these different results, and then we're testing that piece of the puzzle too.
I think, just to chime in, the ultimate goal here, from my perspective, is to test conformance against the API, right? We're making sure the SDKs are all homogeneous in their responses, or at least we have the expectation of they will comply to the API. What they do, like Todd said, internally could be very different, but this definitely looks like an awesome start to me. But to your point around Pete, I think it is kind of a bit of an iceberg, right? We are sort of testing the full stack in a way here.
Yeah, which is kind of unavoidable, and I think it's just good to be really clear on that. And I do think it's interesting, the idea of like, you could at some point, if you could get like a nice kind of like set of kind of Cucumber scenarios, you could in theory also use this as a way to help someone implementing a provider. So someone comes along from vendor X that hasn't implemented their SDK yet, and you just basically say, keep writing code until these Cucumber tests pass.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that the challenge will be kind of enumerating tests that don't actually deviate at all into implementation, but also provide a lot of value. So I can talk more about what those might be, but I think I kind of mentioned some of them. So defaulting behavior and errors, making sure that context is passed correctly. That's all stuff we can pass. The thing that I wanted to make as easy as possible with this solution was the state. So basically, the shared state is all maintained in flag D, which I think is a good solution to that problem. Because if we didn't use a flag D container, what we would basically be forcing everybody to do is to take some flag definition that matches all these features and somehow parse that or read it from a file or something. I didn't want to have to put that burden on all of the different SDKs. So in this case, you just run flag D. To Justin's point, though, the challenge that adds is that now flag D needs to kind of somehow be added here as a dependency. And I don't know if that means like maybe building a separate project based on in Java, for example, building a separate kind of package that consumes both flag D and the SDK under test and kind of building that into its own little package and running it. I don't know what the best means of doing that is, but that could be a challenge. So I think it might require some investigation.
I just want to do a time check. We have 20 minutes left and several more
Yeah.
of the
Yep.
things to go through.
Yep, I'll stop sharing here. So there's a couple other things I wanted to mention. I think I can be short on this one because of the context transformer discussion. I think we can basically preempt that with the discussion on provider hooks. So I won't even get into it. I think that if we implement provider hooks, the context transformer should go away. Steve Arch also implemented a couple interesting things that we might just want to kind of think about. So he experimented with an events API. So I think it's worth looking at that pull request just to do some basic thought experiments around if something like that could work for an event API. And then there's also a PR he opened up with basically a context builder. So that may be too specific to Java to necessitate any, revisit of the spec, but still something to think about. I think that's it for that point. And then quickly, I'll say we basically finished the Node SDK contribs groundwork. So again, this is a monorepo, an NX monorepo, where you can basically add providers, you can add hooks, you can add code that essentially anybody can use to extend OpenFeature and add functionality. And it's where we're hosting the FlagD provider for now. We don't have a Java contribs. I think we will need one relatively soon. That's my opinion, at least. I would like help on that if anybody feels like they have the ability to lend a hand there. But yeah, my plan was to probably go with similar concepts to what we have in the Node SDK in terms of maybe using release please to manage releases and just have a big monorepo of Maven artifacts. Anybody have any feedback or questions about that?
All right, cool.
Is that as far as the Java people? I mean, Justin, do you have any specific opposition to that as an idea, or do you think the contrib project is a good idea?
My main question is like, why monorepo? I have the thought that I had originally, the thought that I had 45 seconds ago was, if we need to update something and there's like a conflict in how dependencies are managed between these different projects, man, that sounds like a pain in the ass.
Could be.
And so that was my thought. This is as much thought as I've put into it. So
I'm not married to a monorepo as an idea. I mean, we definitely did it in JavaScript, but I'm also very familiar with the tooling for doing that in JavaScript. So we can talk about it.
All right, cool. So I just wanted to give a quick update on docs. So we do have like the basic framework in place, but they're pretty weak at the moment. So it's something we're gonna have to really invest some time over the next few weeks. One idea is like there's some content that could pretty easily be moved in there, like the glossary, for example. So if we do move like the glossary to the docs, do we have a strong opinion on removing it from the spec portion, which maybe it doesn't even make sense to be there in general? I don't really want to maintain it in two places if we can get away with it. So if there's no strong objections, I'll probably just start moving that towards documentation and then just update references to the docs as opposed to the spec README. Looks like people are shaking their head.
I think I might actually have an opposition to that one, which is I think the spec should be self-contained and define the terms of the spec. And if we need to figure out a way to transclude that information, where you can be like, this little paragraph needs to show up in that other place with whatever happens to be in Git at the moment, like we can figure that out.
Okay. What about maybe potentially just putting the spec in the doc somewhere, like as a submodule or something?
Yeah, I think having the link makes sense. Yeah, but I agree with Justin. Specs should always be self-contained
Okay, yeah, no problem. That makes sense. Cool. Glad I brought it up then before I moved it. So, and the other one, I'm working on provider recommendations. I have some stuff written locally, but that is something that expect a pull request probably either today or tomorrow. And that just talks about like, recommendations on where you could put your provider, what names you should use if you're going to do it yourself. A couple, basically like ownership information, things like that. So I'll try to post that to the Slack channel once it's available. And if anyone has any suggestions on that, let me know. But that's going to have to be a pretty big area of focus over the next few weeks, I think, is creating providers. OpenFeature SDK without a provider is virtually worthless. So we basically need to have providers be created so we can start testing these use cases and so, I guess look for that. I think that would, feedback on that will be really important, especially from a vendor perspective, to make sure that, it all makes sense and the placements of the repos make sense. And then once they are built, how we can advertise it so people can actually discover that these providers exist. Those are all part of the flow that we need to kind of define. And we have, some ideas there, but the tooling doesn't fully exist yet. So once we have the proposal in place and it's been accepted, I think we can start building out the tooling.
Mike, has there been any thought towards like certified providers or something? Like one of the problems we've had just within ourselves is trying to maintain feature parity across SDKs is really hard. We find it hard. And I just I can imagine that if there's just loads of open source providers contributed and you don't know if it's if they pass if they break the test harness or anything like that, I wonder whether, and there's a question of as a provider, would we approve them, or I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot of questions.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that's something we should talk about. I mean, ideally there would be some kind of badge of some kind, if it was if this is maintained by the vendor, that I think that means more than just some random contributor, that just did it because they find it interesting or something like that. How we can denote that, I think is something we need to talk about, but having some kind of indication may make sense. Maybe it's just putting the provider in a particular vendor's org may mean more than putting it in the contribs. Those are things that I tried to cover in the docs, but that's something I don't fully have an answer to. I don't think we want to get in at this stage into any kind of certifications. I think that might be too much overhead for us at the moment.
Yeah, maybe certification is the wrong word, but or I don't know, just some sort of, I'm just in my head, I've got this idea of a big grid, and you've got the vendor provider or vendor offered provider, or the, I don't know, some approved provider, or it's just we've had issues with Node SDKs, right? I don't quite understand that universe, but there's different ways that you can bring in different bits of code into Node, and there's an old way and a new way, and some people want to do the new way, but that breaks the old way, and
it's ESM stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
For
I
sure.
don't understand it, but it's, I guess my worry would be someone just throws the provider out there, and then I don't know, maybe it sort of decays because the specs changed, and then I don't know, maybe it's simpler to just have an official provider, or a provider contributed one and a open source one or something, but I guess it's a bit down the line.
I've seen this issue in the WSVC where it was really about browser vendors and doing this. I think the best approach there is still a test suite, but in this case, we even had the browser vendors being responsible for running their test suite and publishing the results, which we could then federate. I think it's in every provider's interest to have their provider working. If somebody tries it out and it's not working, then people will just say this stuff is not really working. We can, I think the maximum process we can handle is that for every new release where we have breaking changes, we would ask you to run the newer test suite and publish the test suite results. But otherwise, somebody actively maintaining it, A, that's not a fun job to have, and B, you're not even solving your own problem. So I think the trust should be there, like whoever publishes the provider and publishes test results, look like it more as a supported scenarios metrics. In some cases, some providers might decide to not support probably everything. But that's probably where I would leave it at, but then maybe having like a federated list of those. Well, the federated list, I think, is actually more important if you look, okay, I need a specific feature, which providers can I use? I'm not entirely sure if this is how people usually pick and choose their feature flagging solution. But I think that the first step would be you run your test suite, you publish your results based on a release, what you pass, and keeping it in people's responsibility. Because otherwise you introduce a lot of overhead, and who would volunteer to probably dedicate one full-time person to just maintaining test suites of stuff they, quite frankly, like conceptually care about because they want the project to be great. But when it comes down to everyday work, they're not like that invested into it.
I think you get into some weird kind of political waters potentially as well, where like someone's grumpy because their thing's not officially supported. And then I think keeping it just extremely objective on does it pass the test suite or not makes sense. I also feel like it's a good problem to have in the future because there's so much adoption of OpenFeature. I don't think it's necessarily something we need to be super stressed about right now. But
The one thing that we may want to include though is just say like, if we could have some kind of official stamp, like, yes, this is, like Thomas just worked on the Go feature flag node provider. And if we could just say like, yes, this is like kind of maintained by like that project or something, I think that gives it a little bit more substance than just like, this is a person that's just a big fan of that project.
Yeah.
If we could maybe just have a badge or something as simple as that, and just say like, and then if you have two in the list, then you kind of know which one that, you may want to pick. and just, it's like a tiebreaker, basically.
I think this might be something we put in the docs where like, here's a list of SDKs. Here are the vendor maintained ones. Here are the community maintained ones.
Exactly. And I think it's as simple as that. And then if the vendor maintained ones doesn't, meet the requirements or whatever, then maybe the community one is the next best fit. So, okay. Yeah, look for that over the next couple days.
I think generally people are also quite versed if they look at open source projects to decide whether they're good quality or not. I think every one of us has like their checkbox list that they're going after when looking at the project, like how many people are working on it, how often have to release, what are compliance test coverage and so forth. So
it's mainly around like our docs, like which ones would we want to highlight and how would we make it clear, because there is a distinction, I think, between, vendor or project supported ones versus just community supported ones. So I think that's probably a good idea, just having some, like maybe two different tables or at least a column that specifies the difference. Cool. Looks like Alex, you're next on the list.
Yeah, it was just to reiterate the idea that the research repo now has the OFEP convention, and I put together a template. So if you wanted to get started, I just wanted to spend 2 minutes just explaining how, if you want to bring something to discussion, just create a branch off that repo or fork it and create your own branch and then create a PR off of that. And you can use the template, and we increment the template version to say, hey, this is some feature I want to chat about. What's nice about that is you get the discussion in the history of the PR when it's been merged, but then also you then get the end result. The problem is we were seeing with the issues is that we came to a conclusion on something, but that could be lost, right? That's just sitting in an issue, whereas we now have something that is in the Git log, and we can also make revisions on those things, right, as time passes. So I just wanted to call out that firstly. And the second thing was, I don't know, there's a standard convention in the organization in GitHub. I've noticed PRs have been merged that I haven't finished reviewing. So I was on holiday, I was reviewing a PR, and I had open questions on it. It's been merged in, and I don't care about that. That's cool. But I think maybe as an organization, as a team, we should think about, should we say that at least all issues must be, all questions must be answered, and by answering that means that the person who answers it can't be the one to resolve it, because otherwise I could just answer and resolve, and then that would auto pass the GitHub checkbox. So maybe we could just make a convention of saying, look, as long as the person you replied to closes that out, we're happy. And I don't know, Mike, if this is one for you, but at an organizational level, we could enable that on our projects.
Okay,
Is
yeah, I mean, that seems reasonable to me.
Is this request changes in the approval flow? Is that the GitHub way to handle that?
I think there's require all what is it? What's the term? Require all
Are all
issues
comments to be to issues or comments to be resolved or something like that? Yeah.
That's the one. Yeah.
I'm not sure if you can make that though, so that the person who clicks resolve isn't the person that's answered it. So I don't know. Maybe
Yeah.
this is just something we have to.
I'm not sure if you can, because I keep doing that. Annoying all the teams. I don't think it's possible.
It could
I
be
mean,
arguably a bot, right?
Yeah, arguably there's still some value, even if that's not the case, because the act of going and resolving something has some amount of responsibility. Like it's at least an action that, you know, I went in and I said resolve to this, and it's auditable. You can see who resolved it, I believe. So there's at least that, but I guess the question is how valuable that is in itself.
I think this is just a maturity thing because, you know, as we start to scale up this project and you start to see an uptick of maybe 50 plus developers, there will be things you just simply can't catch, and you can't just merge those in when you've got open questions on them.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like an easy change to make, and we can certainly test it out at least. If someone has opposition to it, you know, we can talk about it at the next community meeting or something. But I'll go ahead and enable it for now, and let's see how it goes. But I mean, it seems like a pretty low barrier, honestly, just to resolve all of the comments on a pull request before it's merged. So.
There's also owners files, and there's required reviewers. Those are things we could experiment with as well. If we decide we need more rigor.
Yeah, my experience with GitHub owners files versus GitHub is really interesting, right? Because you can actually have permissions in GitHub that supersede the owners file permissions. So you might be on one but not the other. You might be on both, and then the behavior becomes like really bizarre. So yeah, if you know how it works exactly, because we've done this in the tag app delivery, and we've had a lot of problems with it.
And I think this is the part of the meeting where we sit in 4 minutes of silence until someone decides to be the scribe.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I missed that last time. I can get it next time.
All right, appreciate it. You had to. You're supposed to wait a few minutes, but no, that was an easy
Oh,
one.
sorry. I'll wait 3 more minutes.
Perfect. Well, does anyone else have any topics that we can quickly discuss, or we can go ahead and wrap it up? Perfect. Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I'll update a few things and post it to the OpenFeature channel on Slack. If you have any questions, you know, feel free to ping us or open issues or wherever. But we're making pretty good progress. So yeah, thanks everyone. Cool. Talk to you later. Bye.